The submarine rose above the plateau, lifting into the waters of Lake Totenkopf. Mooring it well below the surface on the shore opposite Ingolstadt, Hagbard and about 30 of his crew entered scuba launches and buzzed to the surface. Parked on a road beside the lake was a line of cars, led by a magnificent Bugatti Royale. Hagbard grandly ushered George, Stella, and Harry Coyne into the enormous car. George was shocked to see that the chauffeur was a man whose face was covered with gray fur. It was a long drive around the lake to the town of Ingolstadt. It was very much as George had imagined it, all turrets and spires and Gothic towers, mixed with modern Martian edifices straight from Mad Avenue. But most of the buildings looked like they had been put up in the days of Prince Henry the Fowler.
"This place is full of beautiful buildings,"
said Hagbard.
"The big Gothic cathedral in the center of town is called the Liebfrauen Minster. There's another Rococo church called the Maria Victoria. I've always wanted to get stoned on acid and look at the carvings. They're so intricate."
"Have you been here before, Hagbard?"
Harry asked.
"On scouting missions. I know where all the good places are. Tonight you're all going to be my guests at the Schlosskeller in Ingolstadt Castle."
"Have to be your guests,"
said George.
"None of us have any money."
"If you have flax,"
said Hagbard.
"you can pay in flax at the Schlosskeller."
They first went to the Donau Hotel, which Hagbard said was the most modern and comfortable in Ingolstadt, where Hagbard had reserved almost all the rooms for his people. With every hotel in Ingolstadt bursting at the seams, it had taken a huge advance payment to bring this off. The hotel staff jumped to attention when they saw the line of cars with Hagbard's splendid Bugatti in the vanguard. Even in a town crowded with celebrities, overrun with wealthy rock musicians and affluent rock fans from all over the world, a machine like Hagbard's commanded respect. George, following Hagbard into the lobby, suddenly found himself face to face with two ancient bent German men. One, with a long white mustache and a lock of white hair that fell over his forehead, said, in heavily accented English,
"Get out of my way, degenerate Jewish communist homosexual!"
The other old man winced and said something placating to his colleague in a soft voice. The first man waved his hand in dismissal, and they tottered toward the elevators together. Several more old men joined them as George watched, too surprised to be angry. Here, though, in the fatherland of that kind of mentality, the old man's hatred seemed historical curiosity to him more than anything else. Doubtless such men as that had actually seen Hitler in the flesh. Hagbard grandly took a handful of room keys from the desk clerk.
"For simplicity's sake, I've assigned a man and a woman to each room,"
he said as he passed them out.
"Choose your roommates and switch around as you like. When you get up to your rooms, you'll find suitable Bavarian peasant costumes laid out on the bed. Please put them on."
Stella and George went upstairs together. George unlocked the door and surveyed the large room with its two double beds. On top of one lay a man's outfit of lederhosen, with silk shirt and knee socks, while on the other bed was a woman's peasant skirt, blouse, and vest.
"Costumes,"
Stella said.
"Hagbard's really crazy."
She shut the door and tugged at the zipper of her one-piece gold-knit pantsuit. She had nothing on underneath. She smiled as George regarded her with admiration. When the group assembled in the lobby, only Stella looked good in costume. Of the men, Hagbard looked most natural and happy in lederhosen, which was perhaps why he'd had the notion of dressing that way. The Ingolstadt Castle, a battlemented medieval building built on a hill, had a magnificent restaurant in what had formerly been either a dungeon or a wine cellar, or both. Hagbard had reserved the entire cellar for the evening.
"Here,"
he said,
"we'll rally our forces around us, have some fun, and prepare for the morrow."
He seemed in an agitated, almost giddy mood. He took his place at the center of the big table, in a blackened carved chair that looked like a bishop's throne. On the wall behind him was a famous painting. It depicted the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV, barefoot in the snow at Canossa, but with one foot on the neck of Pope Gregory the Great, who lay prone, his tiara knocked off, his face ignominiously buried in a snowdrift.
The story goes that this was commissioned by the notorious Bavarian jester Till Eulenspiegel when he was at the height of his fortunes,
Hagbard said.
Later, when he was old and penniless, he was hanged for his anarchistic attitudes and his low Bavarian sense of humor. So it goes.
"There he is,"
Markov Cheney whispers tensely. Saul and Barney lean forward, peering at the figure ahead of them. About 5'7", Saul estimates, and Carmel was 5'2", according to the R&I packet they had lifted from Las Vegas police headquarters. But who else would be down here, so far from the route of the guided tours? Saul's hand moves towards his gun, but the other figure whirls on them, flashing a pistol, and shouts,
"Hold it right there, all of you."
Oh, Christ,
Saul says disgustedly.
Hail Eris friend, we're on the same side.
He holds up his hands empty.
I'm Saul Goodman and this is Bonnie Muldoon, both formerly of the New York Police Force. This is our friend Markov Cheney, a man of great imagination and a true servant of Goddess. All hail Discordia, 23 Skidoo, Callisti. And do you need any more passwords, Mr. Sullivan?
Gosh,
Markov Cheney says.
You mean that's really John Dillinger?
Rhoda Chief, vocalist and apprentice witch, sampled some of her own Kool-Aid early in the evening. She swore until the day she died that what happened in Ingolstadt that Walpurgisnacht was nothing less than the appearance of a giant sea serpent in Lake Totenkopf. The beast, she insisted, turned, took its own tail in its mouth, and gradually dwindled to a dot, giving off good vibes and flashes of astral light as it diminished. There were many empty places at the big table when the Discordians sat down. Hagbard seemed in no hurry to order dinner. Instead, he called for round after round of the local beer, of which enormous stocks had been laid in to prepare for the great rock festival. George, Stella, and Harry Coyne sat together near Hagbard, and George and Harry discussed sodomy objectively, between long, thoughtful pauses and deep drinking. Hagbard sent the beer around so fast that George frequently had to swill down a whole stein in a minute or two just to keep up. Various people came in and sat down at empty places at the table. George shook hands with a man around 30 who introduced himself as Simon Moon. He had a lovely black woman with him named Mary Lou Cervix. Just around the time George was finishing his 10th stein of Ingolstadt's fabled beer and feeling quite woozy, a man who looked very familiar floated into his line of vision. The man wore a brown suit and his gray hair was crew-cut.
"George!"
the man shouted.
Yes, it's me, Joe,
said George.
Of course it's me. That's you, Joe, isn't it?
He turned to Harry Coyne.
That's the guy who sent me down to Mad Dog to investigate.
Harry laughed.
"My God,"
said Joe.
"What's happened to you, George?"
He looked vaguely frightened.
A lot of things,
said George.
How many years has it been since I've seen you, Joe?
"Years? It's been 7 days, George. I saw you just before you caught the plane to Texas. What have you been doing?"
George shook his finger.
You were holding out on me, Joe. You wouldn't be here now if you didn't know a lot more than you claimed to when you sent me to Mad Dog. Maybe good old Hagbard can tell you what I've been doing. There's good old Hagbard looking over at us from his end of the table right now. What do you say, Hagbard? Do you know good old Joe Malik?
Hagbard lifted a huge ornamented stein of beer, which the management of the Schlosskeller had provided him as an honored guest. It was adorned with elaborate bas-reliefs of pagan woodland scenes, including tumescent satyrs pursuing chubby nymphs.
"How are you doing, Malik?"
called Hagbard.
"Great, Hagbard. Just great,"
said Joe.
"We're gonna save the Earth, aren't we, Joe?"
Hagbard yelled.
"Gonna save the Earth, that right?"
"What do you mean, save the Earth?"
Hagbard looked at him stupidly, his mouth hanging open.
"If you don't know that, why are you here?"
"I just want to know. We're going to save the Earth, but are we going to save the people?"
"What people?"
"The people that live on the Earth."
"Oh, those people,"
said Hagbard.
Sure, we're gonna save everybody."
Stella frowned.
This is the silliest conversation I've ever heard.
Hagbard shrugged.
"Stella, honey, why don't you go on back to the Leif Erikson?"
Well, fuck you, Charlie.
Stella stood up and flounced off, her peasant skirt swinging. George held his breath. Mavis had come into the room. Instead of the peasant skirt outfit Hagbard had decreed, she was wearing what might have been called hot lederhosen, a very short, very tight pair of leather breeches that made her long legs look fantastically long and underlined the round curves of her ass. Just then a tall, stern-looking black man came into the room. He too was wearing Bavarian peasant costume. He went up to Hagbard and shook hands.
"Where's my Stella?"
he demanded gruffly. George felt his hackles rise. He knew he had no right of possession where Stella was concerned, but then neither did this guy. Exclusive possessions seemed the one type of sexual relationship not practiced among the Discordians and their allies. There was a kind of tribal, general love among them which didn't prevent anybody from sleeping with anybody else. An unsympathetic observer might call it promiscuity, but that word, as George understood it, meant using another's body for sex without feeling anything for the person you were physically involved with. The Discordians were all too close, too concerned about each other as people for the word promiscuity to fit their sex lives. And George loved them all. Hagbard, Mavis, Stella, the other Discordians, Joe, even Harry Coyne, maybe even Otto Waterhouse, who had just appeared. Mavis said,
Stella's gone down to the submarine, Otto. She'll join us at the proper time.
Hagbard suddenly lurched to his feet.
Quiet! I want you to all join me in drinking to an engagement announcement.
Engagement?
Somebody called incredulously.
Shut the fuck up.
Hagbard snarled.
Yes, I'm talking about an engagement. To be married. Day after tomorrow, when the eschaton has been imminentized and all of this is over, lift your steins. Mavis and I will be married aboard the Leif Erikson by Miss Portinari.
George sat there still for a moment, absorbing it, looking at Hagbard. He stood and lifted his stein.
Here's to you, Hagbard,
he said, and he drew his arm back in a sidearm motion so as to not spill any of the beer, and then let the whole stein fly at Hagbard's head. Laughing, Hagbard swayed to one side, a movement so casual it didn't appear that he was ducking. The stein struck the painted head of Emperor Henry IV.
Sorry,
said George.
Hate to damage a work of art. You should have kept your head in place, Hagbard. It would have been less of a loss.
He took a deep breath and roared.
Sinners! Sinners in the hands of an angry God! You are all spiders in the hand of the Lord!
He held out his hand, palm upward.
And he holds you over a fiery pit!
George turned his palm over. He noticed suddenly that everyone in the room was silent and looking at him. Then he passed out, falling into the arms of Joe Malik.
Beautiful,
said Hagbard.
Exquisite.
Is that what you meant by taking the woman away from him?
Said Joe angrily as he eased George into a chair.
You're a sadistic prick.
That's only the first step,
said Hagbard.
And I said it was temporary. Did you see the way he threw that stein? His aim was perfect. He would have brained me if I hadn't known it was coming.
He should have,
said Joe.
You mean you were lying about you and Mavis getting married? You were just saying that to bug George?
He certainly was not,
said Mavis.
Hagbard and I have both had it with this catch-as-catch-can single life, and I'll never find another man who more perfectly fits my value system than Hagbard. I don't need anybody else.
Eat, drink, and be merry. You may never see me again, Joe. Somebody at this table is going to betray me. Didn't you know that?
Two thoughts collided in Joe's brain.
He knows. He is a magician.
And
he thinks he's Jesus. He's nuts.
But just then George Dorn woke up and said,
Oh, Jesus, Hagbard.
I can't take acid.
Hagbard laughed.
The Morgen heute Gesternwelt. You're ahead of the script, George. I hadn't started to hand the acid out yet.
He took a bottle from his pocket and dumped a pile of caps on the table. Just then, Joe distinctly heard a rooster crow.